This time, there wasn't a deal. Greeks discovering capital controls. That's to say, cash machine withdrawals limited to 60 euros a day. This as markets worldwide take fright in a big way over the growing possibility of a Grexit. Stock market losses have nothing to do, by the way, with empathy for people who, after a brutal 7 years, now face a new phase of uncertainty. It's over the euro as a whole. One columnist in The Guardian warning of a Sarajevo moment for the single currency, a nation that weighs just 2% of the whole eurozone, sending the monetary union into a tailspin, possibly. A worry? Is it that worry founded in facts? If so, what are politicians doing? Well, when the day began, they weren't even speaking. We soon found out why. The rest of Europe furious at the Greek Prime Minister for calling a referendum for next Sunday, where he's calling on citizens to vote no to EU reform. Sunday, though, can seem a long way away when talks are stalled and Athens has to pay 1.6 billion euros by Tuesday midnight. Germany's chancellor saying she's ready for more talks, but only after this referendum. Angela Merkel insisting Athens has already received from her a generous offer. Today, in the France 24 debate, countdown to Grexit. With us to talk about it, we'll be crossing over to our correspondent in Athens, Natalie Savarakis, later. From Washington, Nikos Tsafos, co-founder of Analytica, author of Beyond Debt, the Greek Crisis in Context. Thank you for being with us here in the show.
Thank you.
And from London, Steve Keen, author of Debunking Economics. Nice to speak to you.
Thank you.
And Yves Bertoncini, director of the Jacques Delors Institute. Welcome back to the show, sir.
Thank you.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, our hashtag F24debate. Yes, as we were just mentioning, Chancellor Merkel speaking in the company of her coalition partner and opposition leader Sigmar Gabriel, warning there won't be any more bargaining until after next Sunday's referendum.
This generous offer was our contribution towards a compromise. So it must be said that the will for a compromise on the Greek side was not there. And this was shown when they broke off negotiations and announced a referendum.
Her deputy prime minister, the Social Democrat Sigmar Gabriel, warning a no vote is a vote against staying in the Eurozone.
I'm firmly convinced that the Eurozone as a whole would be in danger had we succumbed to this pressure. In the end, the Eurozone as a whole would be unstable and fair, and so would Greece.
What are your reactions? Let me start with you, Stephen Keen in London. When you hear the German Chancellor and Vice Chancellor speaking.
Well, if they call this a generous offer, I'd hate to see them playing hardball, because they're talking about in a couple of years' time Greece being required to run a 3.5% surplus on its budget. Now, to put that in context, England, where I'm based now, in the last 50 years, in 6 months of that 50 years, had a budget surplus at all and has normally averaged a deficit of the order of 2 or 3% of GDP. So that much of a cut in spending out of the economy is being required as what's supposed to be a generous offer. That sort of generosity says to me the best thing is to go back to the drachma.
Best thing to go back to the drachma? Do you agree with that, Yves Bertoncini?
Well, technically, I think it's not that offer. In reality, the initial offer was to have a primary surplus of 3.5. But in reality, what was on the table was 1% primary surplus in 2015, then 2%, then 3%, and then a progressive need to have a bigger primary surplus simply to restore Greek solvency. And yes, to allow Greece to escape from the so-called IMF Europe. But to do this, there is one need. It's to have the capacity to go back to financial markets. Ireland and Portugal had to suffer from, let's say, IMF Europe. But they escaped from this simply because they have had some budgetary surplus, and then they were able to go back to financial markets, which is the normal state of play.
Yves, there's a definite feeling this Monday that it's 18 against 1.
Yes, and that is a shame. That is a shame because I think the discussions have been led at the too technical level. I mean, by finance ministers. With all due respect, they cannot take such decisions. I mean, the decision to remain within the euro it should not be made by finance ministers, nor by finance minister, neither by central bankers, by the way. The heads of states and government should have been more implied in this. And I think at this level, it could be not that simple as 1 versus 18.
But it was Alexei Tsipras who, over the weekend, pulls this rabbit out of his hat with this announcement of a referendum that he's going to organize next Sunday, a referendum where he's urging the Greeks to vote no.
Yes, to vote no to a text which is no longer valid, by the way. But, I mean, he has a right to consult Greek people. It's democracy. I mean, it's normal. It's just a bit strange to do this in such short notice, 8 to 9 days, on the basis of a question which is not really clear. But in reality, the question will be quite clear. The question is whether Greek people want to remain within the monetary union with the rights and constraints linked to this belonging. That will be more or less the question. I think the outcome is not clear, and it's not... I mean, the no or the yes could win, and we'll have to wait for the outcome.
All right, early odds, Nikos Tsafos from the bookmakers say that it's going to be yes. But, of course, that's not what's happening. That's not what those who are currently rallying in Athens are hoping for. They're supporters of Syriza urging a no. Was it right to call this referendum?
Absolutely not. I think calling this referendum in the way that it was done, the speed with which things are happening, asking the Greek people to vote on a document that not only is no longer on the table, as Yves pointed out, but that no one has actually seen. It was only halfway through the conversation in Parliament that the documents were actually being produced. This is very hasty. The organization is really difficult. It's really hard to have a conversation when at the same time there are capital controls and caps on withdrawals. I think this is a terrible moment to have this debate and to have this referendum happen so quickly and under these circumstances.
Steve Keen, do you agree?
The timing was forced on the Greeks by the totally uncompromising position the European Union's taken over this whole fiasco. And it begins, of course, with the fact that the euro itself was designed to be a catastrophe. And as Wynne Godley argued back in 1992 in that brilliant article, Maastricht and all that, which people can download if they just search for Maastricht and all that on the internet, it was always a catastrophe. You cannot have a currency without having a national treasury at the same time. So it was always going to break during a crisis. And rather than responding saying, oh dear, the design was bad, we shouldn't have ceilings on government budget deficits during a crisis, we shouldn't have ceiling government debt either, we should let those rise to compensate for the deleveraging by the private sector during a crisis, rather than saying that, they made it stricter. They went for massive surpluses during a downturn. And this is really saying the private sector is taking money out of the economy. Let's also take money out of the economy and watch the economy grow, which is total farce. So I'm not at all amazed that finally the Greeks walked away in exasperation and they played the one trump card they have, which is they're the home of democracy. And in this essential sense, the euro has always been a totally anti-democratic institution.
Nikos Tsafos.
I disagree with that statement. I think that to talk about the Eurozone more broadly, whether it was a good union or not, I have a slightly different view, but we probably can't get too much into that right now. What I do want to say, because we are talking a little bit about history as well, if you look at Greece when it came into the bailout in 2010, it was coming into the negotiations with a 10%, slightly higher than 10% primary deficit, expenses exceeding revenues. And this had really nothing to do with the crisis. There was a slight recession at the economy at that point, but this was really a structural increase in revenues in the Greek state that started from about 2007 on to 2009. And so having looked at the crisis, having studied the crisis, I struggle as to how at a moment where you're running a 10% primary deficit, the prescription can be anything other than you have to stop running that kind of deficit, especially at a time that no one is willing to lend you any money. So I think it's always difficult to separate out the debt versus the deficit question. I've always been of the opinion that austerity, the policies that Greece have pursued over the last 5 years, have been primarily driven by the deficit, not necessarily the debt. There has been a transfer of debt from the private sector to the public sector, the official sector, that's true. But the cuts on the spending side, the increases in taxes, most of these things have been driven by the fact that the Greek state has been running a really high deficit that markets were no longer willing to finance, and rightfully so.
Yves Bertoncini, at this point in time, could the whole of the Eurozone unravel at the first major hurdle, you might say? The Greeks who can't sustain the monetary union, it seems, the way it's going.
No, that's not the first hurdle, first major hurdle. The first major hurdle was back in 2009, 2010, when, yes, the design of the EMU was not perfect, and then changes were made to bail out countries under program, 4 of them, not only Greece. There was a shift, a modification on the design, not only to reinforce the supervision, the control over budget deficit, debts, macroeconomic imbalances as well, by the way, but also to create this kind of European Monetary Fund, the European Stability Mechanism. So that was made. That was made. Countries on the program have had to implement programs which were more or less well-designed, and I agree to say that mistakes were made on this. The IMF admitted that mistakes were made, so we'll have to pay. We, as Europeans, will have to pay for these mistakes. But at the end of the day, things got better in Portugal, and Portugal had the capacity to go back on financial markets. The same is true for Ireland. So now there are only 2 countries left on the program, namely Greece and Cyprus. Very small countries. That's why we should fix this problem, which is not a financial problem at all. The money at stake is not that big. It's a political problem. We should fix this problem, yes, but to do so, Europeans need to have Greek authorities willing to participate in the solution of the problem. So now we will have to wait 1 more week to know what will be their position, depending on the verdict of the referendum.
Wait 1 more week. Let me just read to you what one viewer is saying on Twitter. A failure on Greece is the failure of the EU. No solidarity, no democracy, no union, just interest.
I don't agree on the democratic aspect. I agree totally to say that the way the IMF and the European Central Bank, the Commission, the so-called Troika is acting is not satisfactory at all in terms of transparency, for example. That is true. But more generally, Angela Merkel is perfectly legitimate on a democratic point of view. I mean, it's not because you have on the one side the Greeks who had recently voted that on the other side the Finns are not legitimate, or Matteo Renzi is not legitimate, and François Hollande is not legitimate. They are all legitimate. And they are there because they have been elected through democratic procedures. So at the level of the European Council, and more generally in this crisis, the illusion is to say, well, it's a people against a non-democratic European Union. What is even worse is that in reality, there are divides between the peoples. There are divides between the majority of the Greek people and the majority of the German people, for example. But this is a confrontation of national democracies. It's not the absence of democracy.
Steve Keen, do you agree?
No, I don't. The reason for forming the European Union in the first place was, of course, strongly humanitarian, strongly democratic, strongly about bringing about a brotherhood of Europe. But behind that, the economic bureaucrats, and you know I'm a major critic of mainstream economics, the European economic bureaucrats perceived a large part of the problems of Europe as being due to politicians interfering in economics where the experts should instead take over. And of course, they're not experts. The neoliberal theory of economics is total nonsense, as I show in my book, Debunking Economics. Certainly, the most important thing, it's ignorant about the entire nature of money. So what was designed as a monetary system was designed by people who did not understand money and did not understand the way in which the government sector interacted with the private sector, particularly during a crisis. So the whole idea of the European Union was the ECB and so on was to constrict the capacity of politicians to run deficits. A 3% maximum, as I've pointed out, is pretty close to the average that's been run in England, and certainly that's actually, I think it's below the average for America for the last 60 or 70 years. So it's absolutely bizarre to put those limits in place. It's there to constrain politicians. And then the treaties themselves, look how the Troika reacted when the Greek people elected somebody who was not compliant. As soon as that happened, suddenly Greece was the bad boy. Before that, if you look at the OECD, when they listed who's been doing the most economic reform between 2007 and 2013, who won? The Greeks won, hands down, in terms of economic reform as defined by the OECD. It shows how malformed these so-called reforms are, and the entire structure has been designed to keep the people out of it, and that's why I think it's quite brave and dramatic, if very, very hasty, I'll agree, to put this back to the people in the home of democracy, and I certainly hope the Greeks vote no.
Well, 2 points. First, the 3% deficit limit is certainly not perfect, but it was not a dogma. Take a country like France. During the last 20 years since the adoption of the Stability and Growth Pact, 20 years, only 7 years below the 3% limit. So it shows that it's much more flexible what it looks like. Second point, what was a mistake was to focus only on public deficit. Because in countries like Ireland, for example, in countries like Spain, where the public deficit was very, very low, the problem was the private debt, the real estate bubble, the banking sector deregulation. That was a problem. And then overnight, the debt on GDP of Ireland evolved from 30% to 100%. But that also was a problem of the design of the European supervision, but it has been improved because now not only we monitor the private debt evolution, but also the macroeconomic imbalances.
So a learning curve is what you're arguing. People are wondering what's going to happen now this week and next. We'll be talking about it when we come back. It's the France 24 debate.